Welcome everyone to our 32nd author interaction. And I am Neeta Aneja and I'm the founder of Trends International, which is the platform for art, cultural, social and literary experiences. And with me is Shreya Aneja, who's a budding architect. She's an avid reader and a spoken word poet. To tell you briefly about Trends, it's a vibrant platform that has created a confluence of ethos and aura around the subjects comprising of art, literature, culture, and social issues. The intent is to bring connoisseurs and discerning audience on a common platform with international and nationally famed authors, artists, actors, and musicians for free-flowing exchange of ideas and critical thoughts that emerge from these dialogues and debates to enhance lives and communities around us. So the feedback on a virtual mode of interactions, in fact, the author interactions has been quite encouraging. And given the new way of life, it is growing from strength to strength as it emanates from human core need to stay connected in some form of social mode that Trends platform facilitate. So please do like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, Trends Events, for previous author interactions. So with great delight, I welcome today our 32nd author in our interaction series, Mr. Akar Patel. In fact, we all know he's an author, columnist. He's also been the former executive director of Amnesty International and the former editor of Bhaskar Group of companies, the Bhaskar Group of newspapers and midday publications. In fact, his translation of Sadat Hussain Manto's Urdu nonfiction Why I Write was published by Tranquebar in 2014. So today we'll discuss Mr. Akar Patel's latest book, very much well talked about, Our Hindu Rashtra, what it is and how we got there. And the book has been published by Westland Publications and is available on Amazon and bookstores all around. Welcome, Akarji, on a panel. It's such a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you to all who joined.
Thank you so much. So to begin our conversation, my very first question is, so what made you write this book and why did you choose a topic which has ignited a lot of contemplations, a lot of debates?
Well, I think the main reason was that India is seen as the outlier in South Asia, that the rest of the states of South Asia are majoritarian, that they constitutionally or legally in some way privilege one community over the rest. Afghanistan and Pakistan have laws which say that only Muslims can become the president. In Pakistan, it's also the prime minister who, by law, has to be a Muslim. Maldives has a law which says that only Sunnis can become members of parliament, which they call Majlis. Sri Lanka, in its constitution, privileges Buddhism over the other faiths. The Bangladesh constitution begins with Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Bhutan is probably the most theocratic state in the world, where all temporal power and all religious authority are in the hands of one man, the king. And in 2008, Nepal used to be a Hindu Rashtra by law, by its constitution. India was the only state in South Asia which had a constitution where religion was not part of a law. And I wanted to explore the idea that India became a majoritarian not through its constitution so much, but through its practices and the way that laws became interpreted by legislatures and by the court over time. So that broadly was why I chose to write this book. The immediate trigger was the fact that since 2014, the process that I have described, that of law and policy accelerating towards a particular faith or a particular community, has become so pronounced that I felt the need to write this book.
Absolutely. You know, the book which we're discussing today, our Hindu Rashtra, what it is and how we got here by Westland Publications, is indeed a must read. It is crisp, easy to read, and extremely enlightening. So we should all buy it and read now. You have the link in the chat box. Your book, in fact, answers the question, what does Hindutva mean in practice? I'm, in fact, still reading the book. I still have to complete it, I must admit. And I think I should complete it by the next week. But to a novice, suppose you had to explain the much talked about word Hindutva. How will you explain in your words? Does Hindutva lead to the word Hindu Rashtra? Do we forever question this? And what, according to you, came first?
Neither of these phrases are part of India's religious texts. So if you look at the Rig Veda, you will not find either of these words. They come into coinage and into prominence about 100 years ago in the early 1920s. Savarkar writes his book. It's a fairly short book called Hindutva, in which he defines what Hindu means. And he says that Hindu equals Indian. And because Hindu equals Indian, Muslims and Christians who are born in India and have lived here for 1,000 years can never be actually Hindu, can never actually be Indian. So it's a theory of exclusion. But because he was writing this book 25 years before 1947, he doesn't tell us what the state will do with this. It is a definition that he comes up with. But what is it to do with the state and with government in terms of exclusion? I'll give you an example. When I say that Pakistan excludes non-Muslims from holding the offices of a prime minister, did Savarkar also say that because Hindu equals Indian and Muslim and the Christian can never equal Indian, does that mean that certain offices of state should be held only by a particular community, which is who he thought to be Hindu? He did not tell us that. The phrase Hindu Rashtra is not defined by the RSS or by the Hindutva groups themselves. But the problem is that if you were to examine their texts and if you were to examine the manifestos that they put up from 1951 when the RSS formed its political party, the Bharatiya Janasangh, they don't tell us in what way the constitution will be different under them than it was in 1950 when the Congress brought it into force. So will it exclude Muslims? We don't know. Will it exclude a Christian? We don't know. These were the problems that came to Mr. Modi when he had absolute power in 2014. And I think that none of the previous histories or texts or manifestos of the Janasangh or even the BJP gave him a direction on what to do with the government other than the secular kind of framework that was left by the Congress to him. And I think that is fundamentally where the problem lies, that if you look at the post-2014 lawmaking in our country, a lot of it has become quite similar to what happens in the rest of South Asia. So for the first time, we have introduced religion as a filter and as a qualification into citizenship itself. So with the CAA, for the first time in our history, we've got a qualification which says that people of a certain faith cannot apply for citizenship if they were refugees in this country. This law has not yet been heard by the Supreme Court. I think it should have been heard with a certain amount of urgency, which it did not show. But that is fundamentally the problem, that Mr. Modi has a series of works that have been left to him by the thinkers of Hindutva, including Savarkar, including Deen Dayal Upadhyay, including Guruji Golwalkar, none of which tell him what it is that the government should do. They don't tell him what the government should do either on the side of economic policy, on the side of foreign policy, or on the side of the minorities. Which is why we see today what we are seeing, that there appears to be no real difference between this government and the governments that came before it, except for very specific targeted policies, such as the CAA, such as the beef ban in the states of Maharashtra, Haryana, such as the Love Jihad laws that have come in Uttarakhand, in UP, and so on. These are the very specific minor things that the government has brought to bear.
That's
yeah, Shreya was saying something.
I was just saying that I agree with you. There are a lot of changes that have happened specifically since 2014. but there were a lot of changes that were long coming as well that have somehow taken root right now. I just wanted to ask you about, your book talks about anti-minority foundations of contemporary Indian society, specifically with respect to the legislature, executive, and judiciary. So when we talk about legislature, when we talk about the representation, we see that the number of representatives from the minority community in India is comparatively way less. Why do you think, that is has taken root in India? Why do you think that is the case? Of course, all around the world, comparatively, we are seeing more representation, specifically in US right now that we saw. Why do you think it's there in India?
I think that it's a common theme to South Asia, that the exclusion of minorities, especially those based on faith, is a fairly common theme. So, for example, Pakistan doesn't have in its 4 states a single Hindu chief minister, but India in its 29 states doesn't have a single Muslim. In 15 states in India, there is no Muslim minister at all. In 10 states in India, there is one Muslim minister who's generally given a minority affairs. In UP, even the minority affairs minister in the cabinet is actually a Hindu, the one who looks after Waqf. So I think you've got a situation where we are echoing and shadowing the rest of South Asia, but pretending to be something else, which is a modern, pluralistic nation. Our government is led by a party with 303 MPs, none of whom is a Muslim in the Lok Sabha. It had 282 in the last parliament in 2014, none of whom was also a Muslim. So I think the numbers are quite stark. Pakistan excluded its minorities through law. We have excluded our minorities through a practice. But the exclusion is real. There is no real difference. If you were a minority in that state or in this, you would feel the exclusion. And that's what the numbers show.
Yes. And, keeping in mind this pattern, recently, I think today or yesterday, it was in the news that a report was formulated that India has gone from being a free country to being a partly free country. So that is a pattern that is more significant with respect to the other South Asian countries as well.
I would think so. I think that there are 2 aspects to democratic states. One is the idea of voting, that the population has the ability to freely and fairly choose its legislature. So that's one aspect. And I think we've scored fairly highly on that in that same report that we're speaking about, which is by this group called Freedom Halls. The problem lies on the other side, which is civil liberties, that in a large part of the world, democracy is only partially about voting. It's also about the freedoms that individual citizens exercise and are given. In India, a lot of the freedoms that are constitutionally there don't really exist. I'll give you an example. Freedom of religion is guaranteed as a fundamental right in India. But if you look at my state, Gujarat, if you want to change your faith, you have to give an application to the government 30 days in advance of the time that you plan to change your faith. And a district magistrate or a collector, if you're living in a city, will then look at your application and then determine whether or not you can change your faith. That is not really freedom of faith. They ask you, so the form that you fill out has to have your caste, it has to have your monthly income, it has to have the names of those people that you plan to invite to the ceremony that you plan to have. It asks for where they live. It asks for the reason that you want to convert. This is not really freedom. And Gujarat is not really an exception. All the states, especially the northern states, have laws that restrict changing of faith. And so that's one example. For a more simpler example, the US Constitution's First Amendment says that Congress, which is their word for parliament, shall make no law which restricts free speech or freedom of religion, freedom of assembly. So if you watch the news, you'll see a lot of stories from the US where there are small groups of 3, 4, 5, 6 people who are standing outside a shop or standing outside in some public space, holding up placards, and they're part of a protest. You can't do that in India.
Hmm.
It's not legal. So you have to file an application to the police.
Yes.
Right to peaceful assembly is a guaranteed fundamental right under Article 19, but we don't really have it. So if you want to stage a protest in India, you've got to fill an application form, and the police actually has the right to sort of let you know whether or not you can hold that protest. So we have rights, but practice and policy sort of ensures that we don't really have them.
Coming to again your book, I've always been thinking, do you think Hindu Rashtra is necessary, and what can be done to separate religion from politics and governance?
I think we've done it quite well. There is not much religion in the government in India. The state is not a religious state. It's not possible either under the Hindu dominated nation or the Sunni dominated nation to have a theocratic state. In the Sunni dominated nation, the problem is that there is no hierarchy of the clergy, unlike the Shia. So Iran is a theocratic state where you've got the clergy, the mullahs are in charge of the legislature. They will determine what laws are good and what are bad and so on. Pakistan is not like that. Pakistan's laws are very similar to those of the US. If you went to Lahore or you went to Karachi and you ask somebody what Dafa 302 meant or what 420 meant or what 144, they will know all that. It's the same law. This is the law that Macaulay left us in the 1860s. India and Pakistan and also Bangladesh, we have the same penal code. Pakistan does have laws which punish fornication, which is sex outside of marriage, with lashing and with stoning to death. But nobody's ever been convicted and nobody's ever been stoned to death. So they tried to become sort of a theocratic state, but they don't have the capacity to do that. In India, the only documentation we have per law on what a Hindu Rashtra should be is based on the Smritis, which order society by caste. So, for instance, my caste, which is the Patidars of Gujarat, in Smritic terms, we would be Shudra, who are not allowed to read and so on, and are supposed to be the peasantry, and we represent the lower half of the body, and we're supposed to do labor. But you can't have these laws in the world of 2021. So an ideal Hindu Rashtra is not really possible. What is possible, both in Pakistan and in India, is the legal exclusion or the policy-based exclusion of minorities, which is what you see both there and here, that what the law cannot do, prejudices tend to do extremely effectively. People might not know that outside of Kashmir, we've not had a single chief minister of a state that has completed 5 years who has been a Muslim. This is a population that is 20 crore, 200 million people. It's the population of Germany, France, and the UK put together and more. But they have very little political power because of the deliberate exclusion that the rest of us have forced on them.
Yes. So, I was reading your book and there was one question that I had in mind. So in one of your chapters, I think when you explain about the history of RSS and how they came to be, you mentioned that how Ambedkar had proposed a few social reforms, and Jana Sangh back then had opposed to them, saying that righteous individualism would ensue. So what do you think they exactly meant by that? I think Ambedkar back then was campaigning for the inheritance laws for women. So why righteous individualism? What was it that they meant by that?
There's a certain element of conservatism that showed itself. So we should also remember that most of the people you're talking about are actually congressmen. A lot of the laws that India has today, from cow slaughter to freedom of religion to the ban on propagation, more or less a ban, come out of the Congress. And they come out of the fact that the Congress had a fairly upper caste Hindu representation both within its party. About 97% of the members of the Congress before 1947 were Hindus. And Congress found it very difficult to get Muslims to stand even on the Muslim seats. So these laws came from there. So these were conservative upper class people who did not want to change the traditional laws which denied women, especially daughters and particularly widows, any part of the inheritance. And so what Ambedkar said was that, okay, we've got two traditional laws. We'll pick the one that is slightly more liberal and we'll try and make that part of the bill. But even that was not really acceptable to them, which is one reason why he quit as a minister.
Mhm. True. And I've read a lot online that people say that people who they've had a lot of questions that there are so many issues with the Bharatiya Janata Party, there's so many issues with Congress. And since you're so close to and you've written in your book so extensively about the history of how the Hindu Rashtra came out about to be, what do you think? What kind of option do we have right now to vote for political leaders if we are so sure about the problems that both of them have created so far?
A lot of our problems are not the result of government or of leaders. I think that we have a problem in society which we need to sort out. I think governance in a place where the state, and by state I mean जो सरकार का जो ढांचा है, the people from the postman to the school teacher to whatever else constitutes the state is very small in India. So the capacity of the state is fairly limited, except for law and order, which is something that the British left us. The state is very good at being able to stop a riot within 24 hours or to be able to sort of stop people from gathering in the public. It's not very good at being able to implement policies such as social welfare schemes or education and health. The state is very bad at that. It's good at law and order. This has always been the case. So I don't think that we can blame any one party for this. However, having said that, it is also the case that after 2014, we are deliberately writing up laws that exclude and that produce violence. When you have a state that is weak, when you have a state where you've got lynchings happening in public, you would tend to stay away from laws that will aggravate this. So beef lynching as a category of public violence did not exist in India till 2015. It began after two states, Maharashtra first, Haryana second, legislated anti-beef laws. These are not cow slaughter laws, these are beef laws, by the way. And then the violence begins immediately, which is quite similar to the blasphemy laws in Pakistan as well. So what the state should be doing is that where it is not competent, where it's not able to stop violence, it should not aggravate the problem. One of the issues of the post-2014 period is that we have chosen to do this. We have chosen to specifically go after certain laws that create a problem which is so large that we've got thousands on the street, whether it was the Muslims, especially the women during CAA, or whether you've got the farmers, especially of Punjab, Haryana, with the farming laws. So the government has chosen to take up legislation which it believes is in the best interest of the country, and it doesn't mind the fact that a very large number of people feel that this threatens them to the extent that they are willing to spend 100 days and nights out on the roads. So whether the state should be doing that or not is really the question. I would say that it should not be doing this. We have enough problems of our own not to create more.
That's true. And I think it's a given fact that, the kind of diversity that we have in India, it's rarely seen anywhere else in any other country. So it's a given fact that whatever law is ensured, whatever law is put out, there will be some form of dissent. The maximum that the government can do is not go against a majority, or at least.
Right. Yeah, I'm a Gujarati. I live in the south of India. My wife is a Bengali. I can barely speak to my mother-in-law in the language she knows. Thank God for that. Mm. We had a Brahmin at our wedding who sort of refused to marry us because we were from different castes. Mm. We are very diverse as a people and as a nation. We do have a lot in common as well. But I think that we need to accentuate those parts of our nation which unify us. Any laws, any policies, even speeches from the state, from those who hold high office in the state, which tend to focus on the divide, will necessarily produce division and sometimes violence.
And I feel that all of that is accelerated because of the social media and because of internet. So, if the same things happen 60 years back, it would still have a smaller impact. But now I think there is a lot more at stake because polarization is very easy to achieve.
Two, three things. I think first is, I think the recording of violence is much better in our times because of social media. You would have sort of episodes of violence which would not be registered. To give you an example, the police is at liberty to record what is a riot. The riot is not a term that is uh, completely objective. It is up to the police officer recording the complaint to say, okay, this was a riot. So if you see data on how many riots happened this year versus last year, or 10 years before that, it's mainly because of the fact that the state concerned and the police force concerned have the freedom to tell you what is a riot and what was just a robbery or what was just a murder. The second thing is that social media also has certain beneficial aspects in a society where you've got media which is fairly dominated by the state. India is the only nation in the world where the newspaper is subsidized to the extent that it is here. So the Pakistani newspaper or the Bangladeshi newspaper or even the Lankan newspaper is between 12 and 15 rupees. And the reason for that is that cost of the material that goes into making the newspaper, the newsprint, comes from Canada, is at a fixed price. So whereas the reader of the New York Times would pay 70, 80, 90 rupees for his copy or her copy, we would pay 3 or 4 rupees. So the rest of the money is picked up by advertising, and the government of India spends 1,200 crore rupees every year on that. So the media is essentially subsidized to a large extent by the state. You cannot expect to have 500 crore rupees going to newspapers, 500 crore rupees going to TV channels at the discretion of the government, and then expect that the media be free. Also, I think that the smaller groups, the individuals who don't have a voice, I don't think the Me Too movement would have been possible without social media. I think as a culture, not only us, but many nations in the world, we are accustomed to powerful men abusing women who they work with. And this is seen as the way that it's seen almost as being natural. But I think it's the social media space which gave women the opportunity to be able to push back successfully in some cases. In Priya Ramani's case, we know that it was successful. And so there are obviously things that need to be fixed in social media, and I do not deny that. But I also think that there are some good things. It gives people a voice that they didn't have before social media came to be.
True. I agree with that. There are a lot of boons when it comes to the internet. And specifically during the pandemic, that is what helped us connect. So
yeah, people might not know that India leads the world in internet blockades. The government of India has 70% or more of all the global blockades. No democratic country, even no country that is a dictatorship, has as many blockades of the net as we do. So I think that especially in this time of the pandemic, when the internet is a major source of receiving either medicine or education, we should have this sort of thing where we block the internet, whether it is at Srinagar or at Tikri and Singhu.
So right. One last question before we go on to our very, very popular interactive session. There are a couple of people who are really waiting to ask you a question directly. And I cannot stop myself but ask you this. This is very important because, I'll come back to dissent once again. Why do you think it is so difficult to express dissent in India today? Your voice has always mattered, will always matter, has mattered, but there have been so many troubles for you. Though you do say that what is life without trouble?
I think that the laws are, so we had a freedom movement in that, ended in 1947, where as a group, we came into a freedom. So we received independence as a group. We have yet to go through a movement that many other parts of the civilized world have gone through, where that exercise has been deepened. authority and control lies essentially with the state at the moment in our country, in most of South Asia, all of it, I would say. How do you deepen individual liberties so that the woman of 18 feels that she is empowered to do what she feels like doing, whether it is on the issue of freedom of speech, on the issue of propagation, or of faith, or of occupation, all of which have been more or less banned by Supreme Court orders or by legislation. We need to deepen that. I think we need to look at ourselves and see and ask, what is it that we can change in law and practice and in society, which would make us a truly modern nation? What we have had since in the post-1947 phase is essentially a change at the top. We already had, some of us had voting rights before 1947. It's not as if democracy, if it is understood as the right to vote, came to be only after 1950. That's not true. It did exist to a large extent, and partition actually happened because of the democratic vote. But beyond voting, how do you deepen the exercise of individual freedoms? I think that is the important question that we are faced with. And I think that the essential struggle there is with the state, sarkari dhance ke saath. Chahe koi bhi ho wahan par. I'm saying that it's not as if we had this sort of halcyon period before 2014. We didn't. The state is reluctant to let go of power. How is it that the citizenry, you and I, and the rest of us listening to this, how can we claim our rights in the way that the Constitution and the fundamental rights truly intended? That is, I think, for me, the large question and the most important one.
Thank you so much. Shreya, we'll begin with Mr. Atul Kulkarni. He's a social activist, and he's also on the board of directors of IIM Shillong. Atulji.
Good evening. Thank you, Shreya and Nita. Mr. Patel, I was listening through your, entire discourse. You mentioned a couple of things that, that either of these three gentlemen, whether it is Savarkar, Golwalkar, or the other gentleman, have defined what is the Hindu Rashtra when it comes to governance. So, which means that is absent. Okay. Then you also followed it up by saying that it was who had the opportunity to probably shape the destiny of this country post-independence with whatever leadership that we had. Now, if therefore these are the two things that we see, isn't it a fashion to therefore now start talking about only 2014 onwards and say that everything that is happening in this country is because of that 2014 election results? Why do therefore the so-called liberals or the champions of freedom in this country never spoke about it in all these years and really forced the then governments from 1947 to till 2014 to actually make it the way we think what we want to be? And then if nobody has defined Hindu Rashtra, it is anybody's guess. It is as much as yours guess, as much as my guess. So why therefore then define a Hindu Rashtra in a particular definition and say, therefore, that means what is happening post 2014 is all, against a particular community, against a particular section of the society. What is this? I mean, is there some kind of obsession amongst the people to, talk about it? Because it kind of, if I may say so, catches some eyeballs.
I think that you're right, that most of the laws that we are faced with are those of a legacy that go before 2014. That the right to freedom of expression, occupation, assembly, which are part of 19, or the right to a propagation, which is part of 25, did not actually exist in India. This is not a post-2014 thing at all. So this is a continuation of what has happened So the laws we have now are a very different set of laws than the constitution that was passed in 1950. So that is absolutely true. I would say that the notion that people did not resist it before 2014 is not true. That a lot of people who might not have known, the Jana Sangh only had a 3% vote in Gujarat, that's one state, in the 1970s. But that did not mean that everybody voted for the Congress or thought that they were doing something right. There was always a sense that there is a deeper struggle of the individual against the state. And that has remained constant throughout. I think that whether you look at movements on the side of the Dalits or the Adivasis, to some extent the Muslims, the middle class to some extent, if you look at the reservation policies that came to be in the late 80s, you've always had large movements that have resisted what the state has sought to do. I think what is happening post 2014 for the first time, and I think this is unique in some ways, is that the state is deliberately trying to aggravate divisions within the society. You had violence in the period before 2014, but you did not have leaders who either stayed with the violence, they were voted out, or the party chose to take them out, and they did not speak the language of division. They were, in some ways, I would say, hypocritical in a way that the BJP is not. I think the BJP is quite honest in the fact that it seeks to do what it does. It does not seek to hide the fact that it does not want Muslims as its party members or its representatives in the Lok Sabha, and the numbers sort of demonstrate that. That is
sorry. I don't want to get into an argument here, but I work in the area which is in the Northeast, and I have seen what has happened there. So to say that the other political parties were hypocritic, I would tend to disagree with you on that, because it was not hypocritic when they allowed the infiltration to happen and continue in Assam. They were very clear why they are allowing that. Number two.
Just to respond to that, there is a letter that the Governor Sinha sends to the President. Yes. In that letter, he says he has no data. So the words that he has used in his letter are not backed or based on any facts. The Supreme Court's ordering of the reversal of burden of proof on the NRC, which I think fundamentally takes away from the rights of millions of people in that space, is based not on fact. It's not based on data. I can make any kind of argument I want without numbers on my side. I think that what Governor Sinha did was wrong. I think it was wrong essentially because he did not have any evidence, did not provide it to the president when he wrote that letter. I think
that Indian state also did not go into the details. The government of India, when General Sinha wrote that letter, did not go into the details and did not act on it. Number one, and number two, end of the day, political parties look at how they win the elections.
If I have understood you right, you are supporting what I'm saying, which is that they took action based on no data at all, which is true. That the Indian state performed an action which has disenfranchised 19 lakh people in that state.
That has happened now. But then what happened actually in terms of infiltration continuing and changing?
The problem with what you're saying is that you're using the word action and you don't have any data. Do you know what the actual number is?
Yeah, so that is what the government is now trying to do, possibly.
I think possibly and actually are different things. This is at the root of the issue. The assumption is that the state is being overrun. The evidence is not being actually given to show this.
Yeah, so when the government wants to look at the data and wants to find out the facts, it is being stopped. Isn't that the case?
You cannot reverse burden of proof. Nowhere in the world has the state done in a democratic space what India has done, which is in the state of Assam, the BJP government has hired 2-year contractors on, and this is based on a affidavit in the Guwahati High Court filed by the BJP government. where those who did not mark maximum people foreigners were not given the extension of their 2-year contracts. This is not rule of law. This is not justice. What is happening in the state of Assam, I think, has happened mainly because of the fact that the rest of India has looked away from it. Constitutionally speaking, very little of what has happened, which is locking up people, men locked up separate from women, children locked up in jail for no crime, should have been allowed in a nation which holds itself to be a constitutional democracy.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'll stop because otherwise I'll be eating on other people's time.
Thank you. Thank you, Atulji, for taking out your precious time. Now we have Deepak Khote. He's joining in from London. Please switch on your videos. Deepak Khote, he's a career banker who's worked for more than 3 decades with 3 international banks. He currently works as a consultant in financial markets, and he's a chartered accountant. He's joined in from London, especially. Yes.
Hi. Hello, hi, Akar Bhai. Nice to meet you. I mean, I know, as a person who passionately can feel the pulse of India from thousands of miles away, I think today what I see is that religion plays a far bigger role than development. I mean, we're seeing people running around trying to collect funds for temples, but I don't see such initiative for laborers returning home, hospitals, educational institutions. So, I mean, one doesn't need to be educated to see what's wrong. And Akar Bhai, I think you mentioned right that the problem is not with governments, but it is with the society. And to me, this suggests that we Indians have, I think, lost our collective conscience and headed towards maybe a Syria or a Iran way, maybe not immediately, but in time to come. And when I see a huge similarity between the literacy map of India and the BJP ruled state. So we know what the problems are, but let's look at the solution. Now, I've just received the book, but I haven't really read the book. And I know there is a chapter on how to fight it, but my question to you is whether any en masse education, basic education, especially in the cow belt, would that create awareness of the real issues on the ground, where people start challenging the incumbent government, or should our politicians have some minimum qualification to govern? How can we achieve either? That's a question.
I think that the farmer is about half of the country is farming. The farmer is naturally skeptical because she depends on the weather, depends on things that she cannot control. And to assume that such a person is in some way less able to understand the real world than the rest of us, I don't know if I would subscribe to that. I would also say that we are a very poor country, that even the temple subscription has not been particularly successful. It's not as if they've collected $50 billion or whatever else it is. It's a marginal sum. And that's mostly because we don't have the money. There was a study done by this government in 2018, which it chose not to release, by the NSO, which said that the average person was spending and making less in 2017, 2018 than they were in 2012 or 2013. Which means that we've not been successful as a society in being able to build a sort of modern economy that will take us out of the space where we are, which is right at the bottom of the lower middle income group, towards the middle or towards the external end where China is today. How do we get there? I think that nobody really knows if there is a single answer. I don't think there is a single answer to this. One thing that's true is that the state doesn't have the capacity apparently to do it on its own. There is no magic wand that China's Communist Party had that the BJP or the Congress did not have, which was able to transform China between 1990 and in the 20 years since, which sort of brought it into the space where it is today. So where does the problem lie? I don't know. I do know that we seem to have missed the bus, that there is a certain trajectory, and you will know this since you're part of the space, that most large nations have to follow, which is that they get out of the agricultural economy space and they get into light manufacturing, such as garments and so on. Vietnam and Bangladesh are doing much better than we are. Bangladesh's garment exports are much more than ours, actually. And I'm not talking about a per capita basis, I'm talking in absolute terms. So if you don't have that space, how do you transition half your population out of very small agricultural holdings? 90% of farmers in India do not sell what they grow; they consume it themselves, so they do not have a surplus. So given that large number, how do you make sure that they've got enough work in the places where they live, Bihar, UP, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, and come into the middle class? We really don't know. Nobody does. And I don't know whether there is a route at this point that is actually possible, given automation and the speed at which it is happening. What happens to India now, between now and the next 10, 12 years, I suspect will be quite nasty.
Yeah, I think provided 2024, we have a change. Let's see.
I don't think change in government will mean too much, other than the fact that hopefully what is externally imposed, which means laws that deliberately stoke division or violence, end. But the larger problem of having, how do you lift 800-900 million people out of poverty? I don't know if any government has that within them. Sorry to say.
Thank you very much, Akar.
Deepak, for joining in. Now, next we have Parakram. He's in fact a former journalist. He's worked with Pioneer, Times of India, and the television, my favorite television channel, WION. Thank you, Parakram, for joining in. Please try to be brief. Thank you.
I will be brief. Hi, Akar. I've got two very brief questions for you. First, India is becoming or has already become a fascist country. How is this going to end for us? And my second question is, there is something very wrong with the Indian media today. As a former newspaper editor, and if you could, how would you go about reforming the Indian media? Thank you.
Very difficult questions. I think that fascism requires a certain level of discipline that the state is able to impose on the rest of society, which can never come to be in our part of the world. The most effective arm of the state in South Asia is actually the police force and the MHA, law and order. Even they are not able to fully impose their will. To give you a recent example, the government doesn't want tens of thousands of farmers coming out of the northwest to the borders of Delhi. And they tried to stop them. They tried to stop them with water cannon, with barricades, but they were not able to. They came and they came to the space that they wanted to be. And that's mainly because the state doesn't have the wherewithal to be able to impose its rate. Not that it should be doing. I'm not saying that the state should be violent in the way that it acts. But this is just an example that even the best arm of government, the most well-funded arm of government, is not able to impose law and order and its rate. Given that fact, can we assume that we can be a fascist state? I would say no, that you might have an inclination as a party or as an individual to impose your rate on the full nation. Can you do that successfully? My answer to that would be no, that it's not really possible. What you can have is targeted violence. So you go after some journalists, you go after some civil society activists, you go after Muslim women, and that space is narrower. The farmers' rebellion is too broad. You do not have the capacity to be able to impose fascism even if you wanted to. The question of the media is even more difficult, I think, because we don't pay as consumers what the rest of the world does, and that's back to the old thing, saying that we are a very poor country, that you pay for 36 pages of the Times of India 3 rupees or 4 rupees, what somebody in New York or somebody in London would pay 90 rupees or more for. And it's the same amount of material, of raw material, that goes into that 36 pages here as it does there. It's all a Canadian newsprint, the cost of it worldwide. So if advertising has such a disproportionate influence on the media, and the largest advertiser in South Asia is the government of India, 1,200 crore rupees a year, discretionary. The PSU spend another about 1,000 crore or so. You've got a very high stake in making sure that you toe the line. If you don't toe the line, not only do you get punished by not getting the advertising, you also get punished through licensing. Raghav Bahl, who's one of the most reputable journalists of this nation, was not able to start a channel because he didn't get a license. Or you use the enforcement directorate or the CBI to go after people like the NDTV group and make sure that they are in trouble, and then they toe the line. So it's difficult, and I think mass media's time is gone. I think that both for channels and for newspapers, certainly, I think that they will not be able to survive the next 2 or 3 years. I think social media is the space that we need to look at. What is it that can be developed in that framework that is helpful for civil society and helps the individual and the smaller group to be able to express themselves? Sorry that I wasn't, conclusive in the way that I looked at your question, but I think these are deep things that we all need to think about, and there are no real easy answers here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Parakram. We have Souvik Roy Malik now. He's in fact currently pursuing bachelor's degree in English literature from Ramakrishna Mission, Kolkata. He's joining in from Calcutta. Yes, Souvik, please try to.
Good evening, everyone.
Right.
My question actually follows from the conversation that we have had so far. Mr. Patel, you have talked about economic growth and the way that Vietnam and Bangladesh have produced economic growth, and my question follows from that. Do you think the Hindutva, which is essentially a pushback against the secularism that India had so far, so do you think that we have sort of lost the cause, a strong cause to uphold the secularism? And my question follows because post 1947, we had the cause that both Hindu and Muslim had fought for the freedom, independence of this country, and so we need to care for the minorities. Post 1990, there was this idea that the economy has been liberalized and we need stability in this country and peace among all communities if we want to produce economic growth. But now we have a neighbor who in China who is persecuting Uyghurs in their own country, and in spite of that, they're doing fantastic. They're producing fantastic economic results. In fact, China has lifted more poor people than any country in history. So this insistence on economic growth, that we need to do better economically, do you think that it hinders, because that is what China has done? It has combined authoritarianism and free market perfectly well, and they are producing the results. So do you think that there is this sense among our leaders that we no longer need to care for the minorities, no longer need to instill that sense of stability in the country to produce economic growth? And because people, it seems like even when we criticize today Narendra Modi government, we say that the country is not doing well economically, the GDP is low. So just by producing economic results, if we can, if the government can silence its critics, then it seems like we're no longer required to care for the minorities in the first place. So that is my question.
It's a great question. And I think that it's one that all of us should ask ourselves. The first thing that I can think of there is, do you want to be China? That should we be looking to a model that is authoritarian, that is not democratic, or should we be looking elsewhere? Specifically in the Chinese instance, the minority that you're referring to is geographically isolated from the rest of what we would call Han China. So it is not, it's part of one part of China in the northwest. It is not national. In India's case, we do not have that. We do have Kashmir, the valley, as being a separate space, which is Muslim majority. But of the 19 or 20 crore Muslims that we have in this country, they are spread across all of the states. There is no way for us to be able to do, even if we wanted to, I'm not saying that we should, and I don't think we should be doing what the Chinese are doing in the northwest of their country. It's not really possible. The third thing is that there is a difference between the way that the Chinese address the minority problem and the way that the rest of South Asia has. The Chinese want the minority not to adapt any kind of particular form of cultural nationalism that the rest of South Asia wants. I think that religion is marginal. I think that what the Chinese want there is more or less stability to enforce what they want, which is top-down, authoritarian, what they would call a development. In India, there is a deliberate insertion through legislation and policy to create strife even when there is none. So if you look at, I spoke about this earlier, but in my 25 years that I've been in journalism, I had not heard of the beef lynching till 2015. It is a category of violence that has been introduced by law into parts of this nation. So I would say that A, do we want to be like China? I would say no, and I'm sure that most people would say that as well. B, even if we do want to be like China, it's not possible given the minority problem there with the geographic reality that we have in South Asia. And three, I would say that the way in which the Chinese have viewed development is not necessarily what has happened here, even under this party. To what extent can we claim that a government that has delivered rates of growth that have gone from 8% in the first quarter of calendar 2018 to 4% in the last quarter of calendar 2019, and then have fallen further to negatives? We are not doing what China is doing. So on any of those grounds, I don't think we should be copying them.
Yeah, so just if I can add something to my question. Even in chat, people have mentioned about the economy. We have the fifth largest foreign reserve and so on. Just to follow up on that, I didn't mean that we need to become like China. I'm just questioning. I'm just saying the exact opposite. What I mean to say is that, like John Stuart Mill mentioned, that demography matters in a democracy. My question is, in market societies, do we need to care for the demography anymore? Because, and it's not like we have to become like China, because in a market societies, it is evident, it is gradually becoming evident across the world that we no longer need democracy to produce economic growth. That is what China has shown. That is what right-wing parties in different parts of the world, even Trump had great economic growth in America.
What China and Singapore have shown is the exception.
Yeah, even Trump had great economic. Trump had produced great economic growth in America when he came to power. It increased America's per capita share in the GDP increased, and for example, Russia has been doing well under Putin for some years now.
That's not true. Russia's GDP growth has been in decline for a long time. They are poorer as a nation today, and that's mostly because of the price of crude than they were 10 years ago. But I think if you looked at the data, you would see that there is a fairly strong connection between liberal democracies. If you look at the Nordic countries, Western Europe, the US, and nations that have been able to lift themselves out of poverty and have a certain amount of equality in economic spaces. Whereas for the most part, I think you would see that authoritarian regimes for the last century have not been able to deliver in terms of growth what the democratic nations have been in that same time frame.
Thank you, Souvik. Question. This is by Arish Shaheen. He's a power engineer and he's a great admirer of Akar's work as a journalist. Yes, Arish.
Well, I have no special credentials, so my question would be that I think that in my assessment, the blind conservatism and the rigid traditionalism of Indian Muslims has contributed somewhat to their unpopularity in India, for that matter around the world. I'm just thinking of a thought experiment, if I may use that word. If the Muslims were to become a little more relaxed in their religious attitude, would it somehow lessen their salience in the Hindu nationalist imagination, for example?
I think phenomenal question. I'll give you a parallel from my side. I belong to a community of peasants from Gujarat that has the second lowest sex ratio in this country. So after the Jats of Haryana, the Patidars of Gujarat murder our daughters at birth more than any other community. Do we get vilified for it? I would say no. the actions of my community do not bear, I have to bear no consequence of being born into that community. Is it the same for a Muslim? I would say the answer is no. That the data shows us that for a Muslim, getting a job, getting a space to stay in an urban space that is not ghettoized, getting equality before the law is not really possible to a large extent because of who they are born to be. Whether or not they can improve themselves in any way, it should be a different set of questions than what it is and how it is that the society that they are born into treats them. Can we all improve? Yes, I wish that the Patidars didn't have the second worst sex ratio in on the subcontinent, but we do. If we did improve that, would our status in the society change? I don't think so. I don't think we get vilified for who we are. I think it's admirable that you should say that Muslims should look inward. All of us should. We should not look away from the fact that you have a state in India, and to a large extent, the state is forcing a society to look at a particular community in a way that creates and produces violence and hatred. And I think that, to me, that is the primary problem. Whether or not any community, including mine or yours or anybody else's, has internal issues, I do not deny that. We should all work on the fact that we should improve the way that we treat women in our community or children or our literacy rates and so on. But should we blame ourselves for the way that we've been treated by the state? I don't think in the case of Muslims it would be right. There is a clear pattern of violence in terms of a narrative that is produced against them by the state, by the legislatures, by the courts, and there is a persecution. I don't use this word lightly. I think that it has got worse since 2014.
So, my question really did not have to deal with, the personal behavior of communities. So, for example, you spoke of I think the Patil community of Gujarat, or they have a very, I think, disastrous sex ratio because of such high rates of female infanticide. My question had more to do with the what's the word? The public perception of religious practice. So I will give a concrete example. I think a couple of months back we had this rioting in Bangalore, where a large mob of subaltern Muslims, if I may use a more highfalutin language, they basically tried to kill a legislator. I think it was of the Congress party. It was something which many of us who are a bit more secular would consider to be rather trivial. I think it was a post or something. And then I think you also mentioned about, you spoke about, the history of persecution, all that. For that, you also have to look into history about the evolution of Muslim politics, Muslim self-identity, ever since the 19th century, and the influence of personalities like Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. But I guess we don't have time for that. So anyway, thank you.
I don't know how many people in India know the first thing about Sir Syed or the 19th century. We are not a particularly literate state, and I think, or a nation, and I think that our response to communities tends to be visceral. It is aggravated in many ways when the state intervenes and acts as a catalyst. Can the community do something of its own volition internally that might stop the way society sees it? Perhaps. Is it its responsibility to make sure that the state doesn't persecute it? I would say no. I'm not denying that what you're saying is something that all communities should do. Should we be able to locate the problem within what has happened in the last 1,000 years in some sense, and try and victimize people who are living today in the world of 2021 because of that? I would say certainly no.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Aga. It was such a beautiful and wonderful session. It's been so enriching, and I wish you all the best for the book. And I'm sure people will read the book and will have many of their questions answered.
Thank you very much to you and to all who joined. It was my pleasure. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Weslin, for making the session possible, especially Shweta. And the book is available on Amazon and various bookstores, as I mentioned before. And thank you, audience, for always encouraging and supporting us. You've been always wonderful. And keep seeing you. Do like, share, and subscribe our YouTube channel. You'll see even the recording of today's session in few days to come. Thank you. Thank you.